August 6, 1945. In the midst of World War II raging in the Pacific, a lone American B-29 bomber takes flight over Hiroshima, Japan. The plane, carrying a uranium bomb codenamed Little Boy, unloads its bomb bay, releasing its stored explosive device. A blinding flash. The resulting nuclear explosion instantly kills 80,000 to 140,000 people, injuring over 100,000 more. 3 days later on August 9th, the Soviet Union advances into Manchuria. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers storm the region, wiping out any resistance they come across. That same day, another B-29 bomber takes flight. This bomber, carrying a plutonium bomb even more forceful than the previous uranium one, takes to the skies. As the pilot approaches his primary target, the Kokura arsenal, however, he finds it to be covered in haze. The bomber then directs to his secondary target, Nagasaki, hoping to destroy the Mitsubishi torpedo plant stationed there. Unloading the bomb bay doors, the second nuclear bomb is dropped. The bomb, which fell in the Urakami Valley northwest of downtown Nagasaki, killed approximately 74,000 people, another 75,000 people injured. 6 days later, Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender from the Pacific War, ending World War II.
深刻世界の体制と帝国の現状とに鑑み以上の措置をもって自局を収集せんと欲し。
Although the atomic bombs were devastating to Japan as a nation, they were not necessary given the prerequisites of ending the war.
In spite of the atomic bombs, diplomatic interactions surrounding and involving the Soviet invasion of Manchuria caused Japan's surrender because the Japanese were not concerned with loss of life, the serious concern of communism to Japan, and the nation's failing economy. By the end of World War II, the United States had grown successful in its campaign to liberate Japanese-controlled territories. At the start of 1944, the United States had overtaken the Marshall and Mariana Islands, vital strategic locations close by to mainland Japan. As the United States approached territories within bombing range of Japan, however, Japanese opposition grew furious. America had painstakingly reclaimed the island of Iwo Jima in March of 1945, and now approached their last stop before an inevitable invasion of mainland Japan, Okinawa. On April 1st, 1945, Army and Marine soldiers stormed the beaches of Okinawa and were met with surprisingly little resistance. As Army forces advanced further south, however, they were met with ruthless Japanese surprise attacks. In the ensuing battle, it is estimated that approximately 110,000 Japanese soldiers lost their lives, with anywhere from 40,000 to 150,000 citizens also killed. Kamikazes, or suicide bombers, were also used in battle by Japan to target United States naval ships surrounding the coast of Okinawa. 355 of these suicide pilots were utilized, responsible for destroying 36 U.S. ships, damaging 368 others. The battle for Okinawa was most certainly a gruesome one, but what could have led to such atrocities committed during the battle? Propaganda. Propaganda was spread through the Imperial Army of Japan alongside the citizens of Japan themselves. The Emperor of Japan had always been regarded as a descendant of heaven, but in times of war, he was used as a tool to indoctrinate people. It was drilled into people's heads the importance of protecting and dying for the emperor. Children from a young age were taught to obey the emperor as the word of a parent. Soldiers were told to die for the emperor and that surrendering in war would mean a worse death than even suicide could bring. With suicide made to seem a more viable and glorious option than surrender, the Japanese Supreme War Council, or ruling body of Japan at the time, was focused solely on victory. It is also important to remember that the atomic bombs dropped on Japan were not the only instance of bomb raids on the nation. In a Tokyo bomb raid conducted on March 9, 1945, only 5 months before the eventual atomic bombings, 1,665 tons of incendiary explosives were deployed over the city. The city was set alight. Approximately 80,000 to 130,000 people were killed, with over 1 million left homeless. The Supreme War Council's reaction to such horrific loss of life can be summed up by a statement made by the Chief of Army at the time, General Uzumu, in the August 9th Supreme War Council meeting. Though we haven't made sufficient progress so far in dealing with the air raids, we should expect better results soon since we revised our tactics. But there is no reason we should surrender to our enemies as a result of air raids. This response was void of any care for those sacrificed in the Pacific War. Because of the Supreme War Council's ironclad intent on winning the Pacific War, they were willing to make unfathomable sacrifices. For this reason, the atomic bombs were not necessary for ending the war, merely another sacrifice to be made in the name of the emperor. The mighty Soviet Union was seen as a great threat to the Japanese Supreme War Council. In an interview with Professor Emeritus Timothy S. George, he stated, "The Soviet invasion of Manchuria posed the risk of communism overtaking the, at the time, Chinese nationalist government. Stalin, with the goal of acquiring more power through the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, would do so through spreading communist governments, especially through Manchuria. Having to contend with a communist neighboring nation and possibly internal communist uprisings would be detrimental to the security of Japan." In a Supreme War Council meeting held in February of 1945, a member named Kono Fumiaro insisted that the emperor surrender under the pretense that a communist revolution would occur if the war was to be continued. Emperor Hirohito, despite the warnings of his fellow council members, wanted to turn the Pacific War into more favorable terms, and therefore would not surrender. This optimism, however, was proved baseless after the ensuing Soviet invasion of Manchuria. By the end of the invasion, the Soviet Union had claimed 80,000 Japanese lives while only costing 8,000 Soviet lives. Along with militaristic strengths of the Soviet Union, ideals of communism, which greatly contrasted those of Japan, influenced the nation's surrender. In a follow-up message to a Japanese peace move made by a Japanese ambassador, Natoke Sato, in July of 1945, Foreign Minister Togo stated, "But so long as England and the United States insist upon unconditional surrender, the Japanese Empire has no alternative but to fight on with all its strength for honor and the existence of the motherland." Surrendering unconditionally would put the integrity of Japan and the emperor at risk. Although the terms of the Potsdam Declaration issued for Japan's surrender were not favorable, they would allow for Emperor Hirohito to keep his appearance as a political figure after the Pacific War ended. Surrendering under the Potsdam Declaration was seen as a much more appealing option than to risk being conquered by the Soviet Union.
Japan's crippling economy during the Pacific War made it virtually impossible to carry on in World War II. Under an embargo prohibiting the trade of motor fuels and their necessary components by the U.S., Japan relied on the production of its territories for resources. In hopes of finding these lacked resources, coal and oil, Japan invested in Manchuria, pouring approximately 3.7 billion yen into the region by 1936. The investment into Manchuria, however, was underwhelming, unable to provide for the nation's large demand for resources. Along with a lacking production line, Japan's economy was disrupted by American submarine strikes. At the start of the Pacific War, Japan had an oil tanker capacity of 575,000 tons of fuel. By the end of the war, in 1945, that capacity had been reduced to 247,850 tons as a result of American attacks. On a September 6 Supreme War Council meeting transcript, it is stated, "We are now gradually consuming oil that has been stockpiled. If things continue as at present, we will be self-sufficient for a 2-year period at the most. This period will be further shortened if we undertake a large-scale military operation." Inflation devastated the Japanese economy. Taking into account black market prices, which were the only method most everyday items could be purchased, it is estimated that inflation rates grew 40% to 80% quarterly to the end of the war. Struggling with high inflation rates and lack of funding towards the military, Japan turned to the exploitation of its colonies. By 1945, Indochina contributed to 25.4% of Japan's GDP, which is equivalent to over one-third of the nation's GDP using pre-war exchange rates. In November of 1941, Japanese Finance Minister Kaio Akinori stated that Japan must adopt a policy of self-sufficiency in the South, keep the shipment of materials from Japan to the area to the minimum amount necessary to maintain order and to utilize labor forces there, and nor for the time being the decline in the value of currency and the economic dislocation that will ensue from this. The Japanese government could not support its labor force. Workers faced food rations, destruction of property, inflation, longer hours, and an overall reduced standard of living. This caused many to turn to black markets, a crime that even the Japanese government wasn't ashamed of doing. Japan's reliance on the exploitation of its colonies for resources and high inflation rates meant the economy was on the verge of collapse.
Utilizing the atomic bombs over Japan meant releasing the most destructive weapon ever created into the world, a weapon that would lead to the conflicts such as the Cold War. Because of the Supreme War Council's refusal to surrender, even after horrific bombing, the threat posed by the Soviet Union of Japan, and the nation's ruined economy, the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was the real causation of Japan's surrender from World War II.